Hi, guys. Good to see you again. Now, we promised last week an episode on President Trump's grievances and people he's in opposition to, and not just people, things as well, and how he's handling them. And it's quite a long list, isn't it? I mean, what's on there?
Windmills, plastic straws, auto pens.
Coke.
Yeah, that's true. I guess Jimmy Kimmel, if we think of late night talk show hosts, law firms, universities, we've talked a lot about. Yeah, there's a lot of the 2020 election.
J- Joe Biden, Joe Biden, Joe Biden, Joe Biden.
Yeah,
Crooked Hillary, Barack Obama. We've heard all those greats recently as well.
I think Biden's his favorite. It comes up almost reflexively in almost every speech or remarks he gives, without fail.
I actually looked into some statistics on this, on that exact point, Bernd, right? And the New York Times did an analysis of President Trump's first 50 days of this term. He mentioned Joe Biden 316 times in those first 50 days. Time magazine did an analysis of his first 100 days. Biden was the fifth most frequently used word in Donald Trump's public remarks. The first most frequently used word was great, second, American, third, tariff, fourth, deal, fifth, Biden, and sixth, border. So he said Biden more times than he said border, according to Time Magazine's analysis, anyway.
And that's such a different approach from what Biden did in office, who obviously had many grievances himself against the first Trump administration and people in the administration. He almost avoided using Trump's name throughout his administration. It was very rare that he would actually say Donald Trump, and he would just say, the former guy or the last administration. Different approaches there to grievances.
definitely. It's fascinating to think about what the president has been focusing on the most, and to think that among the top policy issues that he actually promised that he would deliver on, things like the border and the economy, that Joe Biden's name is up there in that list that you mentioned, Katrina. And I think it's especially evident when you watch the first few months of President Trump speaking to the press, that he really hammered home on Joe Biden and what he called the failed presidency of Joe Biden, especially when he talked about inflation and the economy. When he talked about the border, he continuously pointed to what he said was Joe Biden's open border policy. As we've gotten into the next few months of his presidency, we do still see him talk about Joe Biden, as to your point, Katrina, quite a bit. But I thought it was interesting. I remember watching a Senate hearing where the Georgia Senator John Ossoff was speaking to Russell Vought, who's the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and he was pressing him on an issue, and Russell Vought said, well, the Biden administration, and Senator Ossoff cut him off right away and said, no, the Biden administration is over. You speak for the Trump administration. So what is your answer to this question? And I wonder if, as we move forward into this year and further into the presidency, whether it loses its sharpness a bit to point to Joe Biden's failure.
But he doesn't just talk about Joe Biden, which he does a lot, obviously, but he actually has signed an executive order calling for an investigation into what he sees as Joe Biden's illegal use of the autopen being a kind of preloaded signature that presidents, and not just presidents, plenty of people use preloaded signatures, don't they? So you don't have to physically sign every single document. I mean, even this week, we've had some of the closest confidants and closest White House advisors from the Biden administration being grilled behind closed doors with the House Oversight Committee up on Capitol Hill, because they feel, and this comes straight from the president, that there was some big cover up over Joe Biden's mental acuity. So he's taking all these pops at him in public, but he's actually also instigated this quite serious investigation into him as well.
And I think it should be said, 'cause I'm not sure Americans realize just how common the use of the auto pen was. I mean, some people remember back in 2011 when President Obama signed the extension of the Patriot Act in Paris. He came under a lot of fire for using the auto pen for that. But every president, including Trump in the past, has used an auto pen. But it's again almost become kind of reflexive whenever he signs an executive order in the Oval Office, at least these last few times he says very specifically, notice no auto pen here. I mean, it's become kind of one of his kind of go-to lines when he's signing anything.
And the biggest part of that grievance is the use of AutoPen for what he says, possibly for the many pardons that President Biden issued before leaving office. And he's questioned whether those pardons are even valid if they were signed with the AutoPen. It is important to underline once again that many presidents have used the AutoPen for a number of reasons, not just signing resolutions or letters or cards to people, but from what we understand, also more important pieces, documents, and perhaps even pieces of legislation. But it seems it will be a difficult one for the Trump administration to prove. But as you said, Katrina, that hasn't kept him from backing away from that criticism.
Mm. And I looked up what the legal standing was on the AutoPen, actually, and there's a statement from the Department of Justice in 2005, which is when George W. Bush, a Republican, was president. And that Department of Justice statement says, the president need not personally perform the physical act of affixing his signature to a bill he approves and decides to sign in order for the bill to become law. So that is coming from the Department of Justice, the highest legal authority within the administration, under a Republican president. So, you know, it is very commonly used. And actually there was a big controversy when you're talking about the J6 stuff there, Sumi, and the pardons. There was a big controversy, if you guys remember, just shortly after President Trump came into office and he signed all these pardons. And then there was a whole online thing of, oh, well, is he using the AutoPen for all these pardons? Because someone went online and they all looked the same online. But actually that is because the National Archives, the Federal Register, which is where all these legal documents go, they use a kind of image, a digital image of every president's signature. So the documents that you look at on the Federal Register are not the actual documents. They're a digital version that can be searched, can be accessed by people, anyone using the internet. So if you were to go online, it will look like all of these things have been signed by an identical signature, when actually that's just how they're being displayed online.
I think the argument about the auto pen from the administration is a bit circular in that it's just another way to criticize the Biden administration and those policies that Trump successfully campaigned against, as you know, being the work of someone who wasn't necessarily all there in the eyes of the current administration. So it's all kind of one giant grievance against the Biden administration, in a way.
And not just the Biden administration, we're now seeing, of course, a renewed focus on President Obama, which we heard quite a bit of from President Trump in his first term. So this is a long-standing grievance, but this, what has been described by Tulsi Gabbard, as Director of National Intelligence, bombshell revelation that they have accused the Obama administration, including President Obama himself, of essentially manufacturing politicized intelligence that would have shown that Russian President Vladimir Putin interfered in the US election to help Donald Trump win. And he's even said that President Obama should be investigated for treason, which obviously is a pretty significant word. I talked to one legal expert about this on one of our shows in the previous weeks, who said, look, we're not entirely even sure if President Trump understands what type of charge treason is. But regardless, to use that word says quite a bit about his grievance, in this case about President Obama.
And the interesting thing about that, and what we've heard from the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, about all of this, is the person who was in charge of the committee who investigated all of these allegations was, drum roll, Marco Rubio, the then senator, now, of course, Secretary of State and acting National Security Advisor, and all the other job titles that he has at the moment. But he at the time said, we found irrefutable evidence of Russian meddling in the 2016 election. And he was the person in charge of that investigation. So it's really quite unusual. And I think that's why we've seen this kind of shocked reaction from, of course, you know, Barack Obama came out and made a statement, something he very seldomly does, but from, I think, many Americans as well, that they see it as a distraction to the Jeffrey Epstein affair, which of course is still rolling on 4 weeks and going strong here. The president not able to dodge it, but it is, he does have the Democrats firmly in his sights, which I guess in a way is not surprising. They're the opposition, and he's always someone who needs a foe, isn't he?
And I mean, it's interesting, just it reminds me very much of the this is Trump of old. His list of grievances, in particular with regards to this issue, are people he's had grievances for a long time. James Comey, James Clapper, Susan Rice, all these people that he's been taking issue with for a very long time. That kind of came back. But as you mentioned, I think the timing for certainly for most Democrats and a lot of Trump's detractors, it was kind of suspect for them in terms of it all these revelations coming as he was under so much fire from his base about the Epstein affair. And this is an issue that is generally quite popular with his base. The whole Russia Gate scandal, as they see, is something that he's been kind of using for a very long time. So it's kind of this is kind of retro Trump grievance in a way.
But he's been acting out a lot of those grievances on the Department of Justice, hasn't he? Both, the kind of headquarters of it here in Washington, D.C., and then various branches and courthouses around the country in various different states in terms of the number of people he fired. I think it's kind of somewhere between 50 and 100 major prosecutors have been let go at this point. Anyone who worked on the criminal cases against Donald Trump, anyone who worked on investigating the January 6th assault on the Capitol, they've been all fired as well. So he's really kind of turned his gaze inward as well on these people, many of whom are career civil servants. They were not political appointees, and they fight the cases that they are charged to fight.
I also think it's really important to point out that in the eyes of the White House, this is part of the kind of the promises made, promises kept ethos they've had this administration, because these are all things that he said quite explicitly that he would do when he was still on the campaign trail in terms of the Department of Justice, for example. And when you speak to people at the White House about this, I mean, they're a little surprised at the level of surprise in the media and in the public because these are things that he said, but perhaps not all the details, but he did say he would take aim at the Department of Justice, and people voted for that, and he won.
Mm.
I think it's really interesting to compare also to his first term, where you did see President Trump speak about many of the grievances that he had with particular individuals. And he actually tried to use the FBI and the Justice Department to pursue some of those individuals. He looked into or wanted John Kerry investigated for what he said was continuing to speak to the Iranians as Donald Trump was trying to dialed or unravel that Iran nuclear deal that John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, had worked on. There were other individuals like his former associate Michael Cohen or Omarosa, who worked in his White House. And at the time, he tried to push the levers at the FBI again and the Justice Department. And as we talked about in the pod in the past, one of the big differences between these two administrations is the feeling that in that first term, he didn't have loyalists working for him in the very institutions he wanted to use to enact some of his agenda. Well, what you were just describing, of course, letting go people in the FBI and Justice Department who they believe were politicized, gives them the opportunity then to pursue more of these grievances, perhaps unfettered.
I think there were issues, when you're talking about Burned, people not being shocked and surprised. I think people anticipated that he would go after some of those high profile names that appeared every day that he would speak about on the campaign trail. But, having speaking to some experts in law enforcement over the last few months about this, they were quite surprised that he was looking for lists of names of FBI agents who had in any way at any time worked on the January 6th cases, which amounted to thousands and thousands of FBI agents, some of them incredibly low level, who, joined the FBI with a certain understanding of what that job was, an entitlement to anonymity, an entitlement to be able to kind of go about their job in the interest of America and whatever case they were charged to do. And suddenly thinking that their name would be on the president's desk or published online was something that was quite shocking to a lot of those law enforcement and their representative bodies as well.
Particularly when of course most of these agents, they don't necessarily have their choice in assignments. They're assigned
Exactly,
cases
yeah.
from their bosses. I think that kind of speaks to, in January, I remember we spoke about how disciplined this administration seems in comparison to the first one. And I just think this shows the level that they've gone to ensure kind of, I don't want to say ideological purity, but at least that everyone is on message or not, in their view, kind of working behind the scenes against the president's agenda. I think that went much, much, much further than anyone, including I'm sure many people in these agencies or at the DOJ, for example, that they thought it would.
And if you look at some of the grievances that President Trump has launched, when looking at the legal system in general, that has also been very prominent. I mean, we've talked on this pod before about the federal judges who have tried to stop President Trump from enacting some of his agenda, whether it be on immigration or on a number of other issues. President Trump has said in his interviews that they have been very successful in the courts. The reality is that it's been quite a battle. But that is one place where he has said that he is facing radical leftist judges. That's something that he's talked about quite a bit. So that is, in particular, when you look at the legal system, judicial system, one that we've seen him air over and over again. And then, of course, the big law firms. He's gone after some of the big law firms. Not one that he's necessarily posted quite a lot about on Truth Social, but we understand that it has been important to him and his administration to go after law firms that have represented those who he believed had vendettas against him.
And the punishment for those law firms is many pro bono hours in legal fees for him. And not all, but many of them have capitulated, haven't they? They don't want to face the sanctions, and they've kind of agreed to what the president has been asking for. And not unique to law firms, as we know. We've seen settlements, haven't we, from Columbia University, from Paramount, from a couple of media firms, because, of course, the maybe biggest and baddest baddie in the room as far as President Trump is concerned sometimes is the media, our own profession here. And I mean, Brent, you're in the briefing room a lot more than Sumi and I are, but I mean, how has that kind of come to fruition, would you say?
Well, I mean, besides the obvious in terms of the rhetoric coming from Caroline Levitt during these briefings, I mean, almost every briefing she'll have sheets of paper, for example, with headlines that they see as objectionable. I think there's also kind of that looming, generally unspoken threat that any reporting that the White House deems as particularly objectionable would have repercussions. I mean, we recently saw the Wall Street Journal, for example, they were booted off Air Force One for the trip to Scotland. And one bit of color I think is interesting also. Now, just outside the briefing room, there's a framed copy of the court order allowing them to bar the Associated Press from the press pool. And I think the message is it's not subtle there. What
I think it's very clear.
yeah, what the administration thinks or could be the consequences for doing something they're particularly not in favor of. So I think there is kind of always that looming threat of what happens if one pushes too far or the administration really objects. But I think in practice, at least most U.S. news outlets, I mean, they're going to do it anyway. But there is that kind of specter looming over them whenever there's a big story about the president or the White House.
Yeah, and I think, that again to me is a reminder of how things have changed from the first Trump term to the second Trump term, where we did hear Donald Trump speak often about the fake news media in his first term and accuse journalists of publishing biased stories about him. But we've seen the real consequences this time in a way that we haven't in that first term. And I think there's more teeth to that grievance, if you will. And of course, we can't talk about his grievance against the media without talking about some of these lawsuits that have been settled. The one that was settled between Paramount, the parent company of CBS News, for $16 million for that edited video clip of the interview that 60 Minutes did with Kamala Harris, the vice president. And CBS News and many journalists still maintain that that was a standard process of editing TV news interviews. And we all know in conducting longer interviews that we do edit them down for time and for a number of reasons. But CBS was willing to pay that out, as we understand. And the accusation is that because they wanted the approval for a merger with the company Skydance. But that really sent shockwaves, you can say, through the media.
And the follow-on, of course, from that was that the late-night talk show host, Stephen Colbert, on CBS, lambasted his parent company's decision to do that. And a few days later, news emerged, his show's been cancelled. And, various reasons have been given for it, audiences, funding, etc. But there's been much debate here, hasn't there, about how that was just a political move and that they really wanted that merger deal to go through, as you mentioned to me. And this was, seen as perhaps the price that had to be paid. I mean, we don't have hard evidence of that, but that is what people familiar with these matters seem to have come to the conclusion of.
And I find it fascinating how the grievances dovetail here because a lot of the White House's grievances with at least the US quote unquote legacy media is that they very much are still of the opinion that the media uh, favored Kamala Harris and before that Joe Biden over Trump. I think there's people in the White House that are very, very convinced that that was the case. I mean, so it's kind of they're all branches of one giant grievance in a way.
Not that it did Kamala Harris any favors if that was indeed the case. I mean, he still won, didn't he? And how often were we talking about last year about part of his success and popularity was due to the embracing of new media, podcasters, people who don't kind of aren't committed to being objective in their line of questioning, and can be sort of somewhat cheerleading for the person they're interviewing, regardless of how that is. And where I think we've seen this manifest itself as well inside the White House, it's not just the threat of lawsuits or settlements and so on. It's the fact that the press team there have taken back control over the rotation of the pool, which is, the small team of journalists and photographers and camera people who report on the president and then share it with the wider media pool. And because they are now selecting that and they've widened out the number of people who are in there, the types of questions that President Trump gets asked are quite different to what they would have been, any president would have been asked in the past. I mean, often they are, questions like, oh, tell us how amazing you are, or words to that effect, as opposed to, can you comment on this big world event that's just happened today? I mean, it feels very different, the news coming out of the White House.
And the White House would see that as approaching an audience that isn't necessarily going to watch those older news outlets. But at the same time, the White House is very keenly aware of audience sizes, for example. So, at the beginning of the administration, we saw more briefings specifically for kind of small podcasts, regional podcasts, for example, that have kind of dried up in recent months. And, I think that's a reflection of the White House realizing that as much as they, in some cases, don't like how the legacy media behaves or what they report, it's still such a huge part of getting the president's message out there. So I mean, it's a bit of a tricky balancing act to at this one point attack the media and the other point kind of have them be necessary.
And let's be honest, like it is good to have that room open, though. I mean, like even for us as a non-American network, when I first arrived in this town, and it was like a total lockhold of the big US media organizations. So no one's criticizing the opening up and the allowing in of more and varied types of media organizations.
It just is especially pronounced when there's only time for 2 or 3 questions to the president. And those 2 or 3 questions are given to sometimes that friendlier media, these new podcasters. And then when it comes to really, really important issues, whether they be foreign or domestic policy, that we don't necessarily get an answer from the president. That, I think, is just a reminder of the fact that we are seeing a different media landscape. But before we stop talking about grievances, we have to talk about some of the more interesting ones we haven't, like paper straws. I've always been fascinated by the fact that President Trump is so deeply offended by paper straws. They do kind of disintegrate. I get
They
that.
are terrible. Paper straws are terrible.
Are terrible.
I don't know. I know plastic straws are bad for the environment, but those more permanent straws you can get and put in your dishwasher, like stainless steel ones or whatever, are they not a happy medium? They don't disintegrate and they don't kill any fish either.
No, and I mean my other kind of favorite, I wouldn't say favorite grievance, but one that seems to have come up a lot recently is wind power. In Scotland,
Yeah,
we heard Trump say, without providing any evidence, that it's making the whales go loco. That was his term,
right.
and that's such an old grievance too. I mean, he was in that court battle in Scotland over the view from his property and the windmills destroying it. So I thought it was really interesting. He doesn't forget things. I think what is one thing that's fair to say about this president. If he has a grievance, it might come back years down the line.
Okay, well, we are out of time for another week. See you next week, guys.
Bye. See you soon.
Bye, guys.
Actually, I won't see you next week because I'll be on holidays. Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so do please leave us a comment below or you can email us on path@bbc.co.uk.